Okay. Okay. I'm really delighted to welcome back, but not to Saas-Fee, but to the EGS, Heather Yeung, who joined us last year in London for a meeting and did an absolutely breathtaking reading of Mallarmé's Un coup de dé. And so I'm all the more eager to hear tonight's installment. Heather received a PhD at the University of Durham. She's currently a reader in poetry at the University of Dundee. She represents a field which I consider painfully underrepresented in general these days. That's poetics, poetic theory, but also the practice of poetry. Underrepresented and I think underattended, if I may use Svetan's word from earlier in the week, which involves a particular kind of attention. And Heather, I have to say, always shows that. I just want to mention a couple books that she has published. One, Spatial Engagement with Poetry, back in 2015. Another on literary plasticity, 2020. And she has a coming book on Celan called The Figure of the Poet. And let me urge you to take a look at the EGS faculty page for her. You can see more references. And I see that she has a nice presentation on her own University of Dundee page. Pretty nice. Anyway, it was written by her, so it's not too florid. But in any case, it's useful. Her topic tonight is notes on tone in the West. And I was reassured she didn't mean the Western United States, which is why we were playing Hillary Hahn when she came in. So with that, let me welcome very, very warmly Heather Yeung. Thank you.
It's really strange to be on this side of this desk. I'd like to start with two epigraphs. The first is from the notes taken by Paul Celan in the mid-1950s on the section on versification in Hegel, the second volume of Hegel's Aesthetics. And the note is, Iktus equals Stoß, Schlag, Ton, Nachdruck, line break, Zeiteinschnitt. It's sort of in homage a little bit to all of the punching that's been going on, but to put tone right in there. Iktus equals Stoß, Schlag, Ton, Nachdruck, Zeiteinschnitt. And another epigraph, which is from Solon, the 26th fragment, or the 20th fragment, depending on your numbering system. And it's the first attestation for the word metapoetics, metapoeison. Kai metapoeison liae stadi ude da aire. And metapoize, or rebuild, clear-voiced singer, from here on your song. And it's kind of a command to maybe sing a little different from one of the founding fathers of Athens. Section 1, Epitone on tone reception. Consider a generic modern scene. A person in or entering a room with others. Speech is traded by the various others. The person or figure on which we are focalized, or who has brought us to notice the space in the first place, to notice it perhaps in a certain way, perhaps we followed them there, contributes. Trading of speech continues. The figure on which we focalize is taken to one side, is asked or told, or both, to mind or watch their tone. The scene dissolves. And on that subject, and I don't have it here, but you've got an excerpt somewhere from Apollonius Rhodius' Argonautica, and I brought my trusty Loeb, Volume 1, with me, and at the security control at Edinburgh Airport, it set off a beeping. And so this whole talk has sort of been policed at the outset, but we got Apollonius here. I'd like to begin to develop a claim that this generic scene of tone policing is the rearticulation of the foundation of the idea of Western art and aesthetic judgment, that tone has a particular tone in the often called West, indeed is the beginning of the idea of the poetic or of art, which overwrites other ideas of the poetic or art, that tone in and of the West is a part of the weird but often still prevailing construction of the very idea of the West itself by itself. In and beyond this talk, this is a claim that a certain idea of tonality is foundational for the West. There's so many scare quotes in this passage, you have no idea, which I will emphasize as I can. Foundational for the West, that a certain type of tone policing is inscribed in the invocation of the word West and its ideological functions, the variant modes of its tabula rasa complex. West always comes with a certain tone, with tension held. That tension we find a kind of a lovely exposition of by Edward Said, for instance. To find abuses is perhaps a useful way to set out. Abuses being perhaps easier to notice and put to work. Abuses often being rather precise in what they exclude in themselves. Thus, we're going to look to find tone under the duress it is put, to find tone in, ultimately, its relation with judgment and interpretation, to try to work out if it is possible to find tone out with or in indifference to this relation, and the poetic will be our guide. The scene I have narrated is in a way prefatory to this talk, but considered as epitone, a condition that is epitonic, strained or stretched beyond, be this upon or over or to a given limit state, beyond a normally accepted limit. As epitonic, it acts on the conditions of today's consideration of tone. The move here from graphine of epigraph to tenine of epitone, the latter of which gives us the tone to which our beyond state is prefixed, is a move toward the tone conditions under consideration. And we're going to operate for the poetry fans in this room. This is a marvelous talk that Jeremy Prynne gives called Mental Ears and Poetic Work. We're going to operate with what Jeremy Prynne calls mental ears in mind, which is what he calls a complex and recursive activity, evolutionary by retroflex reconnaissance from the outcomes of the experiment back to the experimental matrix itself and its shifting points of origin. The operation and navigation by mental ears, whose registers are phonic, philological, poetological, and poetic, allow us to sound out the sheer extent to which tone conditions in the crucible of the idea of the West are bound up with what we hear when we hear poetry. And in working through a series of poetic and tonal fallacies, we may then be conditioned to listen out for what alternative figuration possibilities, what different sets of relation and relations emerge, but must we always claim tone as tension to do with relatives? Says she, looking to see if any of them are there, which is to say that it is instructive to examine a long history of tonal affirmations in order to potentially regain the concept of tone for the affirmative rather than destructive, a sensible attunement to tone, a speculative proto-emancipatory work against political policing, divisibility and individuation in its actions of hearing what is, what pretends to be, and what is not. Tone burdens the gamma ut of the arts. Tone of voice, of sound, of note, of moral or syllable, of word, speech, text, style, character, tone and color, tone as texture, Tonkunst or Tonart of the musical, literary, plastic and rhetorical arts. The physiological, the condition of the body, the condition of hearing possibilities, the question of weight, the atmospheric, we kind of have that going on as I bring Scotland to Saas-Fee, tonnerre, thunder, donner, and tones of light and shade, extensions of clair-obscur. And through phonic patterning, tone bears false and poetically true relation to a familiar possessive and masculine you, the French ton, and the hypermaterial clay, the German Ton. In writings on tone, tone appears qualified. It has a this or that tone, which might give its operations a false appearance of being relative. Tone is simply not representational, and tone operates at points of tension, produces tension. Tonos, our Greek beginning, begun in proto, ten, anything at a stretch, taut but flexible, betwixt things but not relative. One epitome is the strong elastic rope that secures the sail of the ship to the mainmast and allows for flexibility in rigging, boom position and mainsail orientation, from whence the epitonic, the condition of being under more than ordinary strain, primed to navigate in any direction. Tone, then, one might hazard, makes its demands clear. Matrix, tone against tone. So I'd like to share an scene of our opening scene. Of course, we're just going to Homer. Upstairs, Penelope, in Emily Wilson's translation, which allows you to take the line numbers from the Greek and the English, so it's super neat in that sense. Upstairs, Penelope had heard the marvelous song. She clambered down the steep steps of her house. then stopped and stood beside a sturdy pillar. In tears she heard the holy she told the holy singer, stop. Sullen Telemachus said, Mother, no, you must not criticize the loyal bard for singing as it pleases him to sing. So steel your heart and listen to the song. Go in and do your work. Stick to the loom and distaff. Tell your slaves to do their chores as well. It is for men to talk, especially me. I am the master. That startled her. She went back to her room. A scene of tone policing is also a scene of multivalent interpretation and of judgment upon which one seems, with and against one's will, to operate interpretatively, offering so-called nuance to a scene by colouring it with intention indications, fillers, or directives. Suspense is in some way created in one's waiting out to see what the results of one's interpretative colouring is. And here already is tone two ways, what inflects things and tests us, what keeps us gripped and orientates us in and out with the work. Is this the scene where the rules of engagement with aesthetic perception are being set? With narrative distance, we can break it down a bit. The mother-wife-queen figure, Penelope, here's a song or poem, so this is before Poetics comes into play, being performed in the hall. She is moved by it and moves towards it with her own group, which is to say two of her personal slaves, which are written out variously in some of the translations of the Odyssey, standing slightly to the side, and she asks the male singer or poet to change their subject matter and style. Of all of those assembled, the singer-poet, so-called suitors, presumably more slaves, it is the son figure, Telemachus, who responds, indicating that Penelope's speech comes off as inappropriate, that he controls speech, and the word there importantly is muthos, and that she is asked to remove herself and her accompanying slaves from the scene. The variant audibilities of tone of sound, everyone in the building hears the song and is drawn towards it. And the reception of apparent tone leads to the scene of tone policing, which allows the positing of paradigms of inclusion and exclusion, so tone judgment. Tone as register of speech, which is either appropriate or inappropriate, which is also to say, Telemachus might be saying, Mother, your tone is off. You're super hysterical, you're super emotional, you're just embarrassing. If you can't change your tone, go away and do the things I believe you do. Which is normatively gender policed, and through which extension of excellent inclusion to matters of category bias, we might extend the scene almost infinitely within different classificatory markings of the spatial and social. Classifying tone per reductions registers generates the performance of a form of knowledge which judges, knowing as articulation of knowledge. Such seemingly useful classifications generate a situation in which the reactionary use of tone as excuse for understanding tone's weird relation to the intentional fallacy within the sphere of judgment beyond the aesthetic, generates active participation in a series of normativizing classifications. So this is one tone form. What are the discordances within and outside of each register are categorized through exclusion into concord. So in a sense, ultimately, syntaxis dominates over parataxis, and suppression of opposition over tension creation, sort of everything over ictus. And ultimately are an advanced mode of tone policing, of the muthos of listening in, of an apparent muthos or myth of tone in and of the West. But different tone concepts are also operative here. And the scene, too, shows us the relation between the condition of poet in its normative cast in the Western imaginary, in its foundations in relation to the idea conjured by the word West, in place between, as we will discover, megaron, so the hall, under the logic of muthos, and oikos, which is sort of where Penelope is sent back. We begin with the reception within the scene. So first tone is received. In this case, it is the song of the bard, and both, as Emily Hauser in a recent kind of brilliant, absolutely kind of linguistic archaeological reconstruction of the use of the masculinization of song and poet in kind of ancient Greece, both, as Hauser so perspicaciously points out, as are overwritten by the male and the masculinized. In that sense, which reverberates to both the hearing of and listening to a given sound. The sound reverberates through the house from the central hall, creating an environment which is tonal in the sense not of a given quality of voice, but of created sound, where tonality for a moment is ambient to the extended space, central hall, women's and slaves' quarters, stairways, Penelope comes down a ladder, etc. The central point of tone creation, the bard in the hall, generates a set of spatial or locative coordinates predicated on the resonance of tone creation, which become increasingly kind of aleatoric the further away one moves. The house becomes an instrument of tonation, not intonation, just of tonation, a display of a particular organization of tone whose ultimate articulation is regime instantiation. Rereading the scene with this kind of telemachian, the sort of self-nominated muthos-holding position in mind as instructive in this sense, Penelope remarks on song as unduly effective and inappropriate given the current situation. She's got kind of a gorgeously measured speech. But Telemachus notes Penelope's hearing as eavesdropping and hears her speech as backtalk, and responds by giving out what Mary Beard has called the first recorded example at the right at the start of Western literature and the Western imaginary of man telling a woman to shut up. And this is annexed to one of the first ever depictions of a so-called poet and the effects of poetry, right? Telemachus emphasizes that it is men, andron, that control speech, muthos, this being public or public forming speech, and thus also the control of the poetic mode through its economization. It's no coincidence that the bard's name, Phemius, means in one sense, he's been bought out by the suitors to perform, right? It means in one sense word man or speaking man, but also yes man, nor that eidos here is masculinized, so the word for bard, and it's a privative name for the poet, which poet is across the whole Odyssey. Phemius is kind of clearly up for sale. If you track Phemius in the Odyssey, it's an interesting problem of the hyper-economization of the idea of what a poet is. The scene allows for the imposition of an ordering of appropriate behavior under the auspices of an ontology of language, where language's apex is regulated public speech or its own regime instantiation, muthos, mind your tone, or if you can't leave, is inscribed into this form of reactionary and regime instantiating speech creation, which creates its allowances. But lest we forget, it's extraordinary, maybe, or unordinary language, as not language or a song, which conditions the scene to work and work upon us in the first place. The other poem, barely perceptible, thrums under the poem. It's ongoing, right? Conditioning our orientation to listen poetically, even before poetry bears the name we give it now. And we'll come to the moment where poetry bears that name later on in this talk. The bard, however so much he has brought out, its intonation is intonation point, undertone, overhearer. We might extend the old Popian maxim, Homer makes us hearers, to the hearing staged within Homer, or what poetry bears the symbolic name Homer, the poet already divided and unapparent, of Homer, which is to say the question of the figure of the poet and the use of poetry, the question ultimately of what tone is when put to use. This is to say, the scene is also a demand to hear and read itself as performing and debunking its status as systematic linguistic unfolding from sound into meaning-making, into communication of unconscious desire, staging the possibility of hearing otherwise. Homer makes us poetic hearers by staging poetic and poetological hearing and mishearing, heard and misheard. In an aesthetic dimension, I suppose, Penelope's response is effective. She's emotionally moved. She's literally moved by the song in terms of its subject matter and tone. She presents the case to the poet that they possess a series of different tonal registers of song. I don't think this is on the excerpt, I'm afraid. And why not something less upsetting? Here, poetry is something that unduly moves us, that is, if we track her movement through space in the scene, literally performing kind of perihoupsos and catabasis, a sublime threshold-crossing propulsion. But although the emotions poetry evokes here are real in Penelope, according to Penelope's definition of poetry in her plea to Phemius, we can turn it on and off, poetry itself, right? And change its course. This is a sort of a form of the metapoiesis and command. The poet controls the valences of their song. Compare this to Telemachus's response, where, more moved by his mother than the poet, and we'll come on to that, for the poet has been brought to a certain purpose, he responds that Phemius is not to be so commanded, because the poet, God-inspired, is not in control of what he sings. In these cases, poetry, subservient to a given command or plea, so the test has a control mechanism, translates into a use value whose purpose is to provoke an expression of character. In the test, we could say Penelope yields to poetry, Telemachus withstands. But at the same time, in the one case, for Penelope, poetry can be heard and received by all and brings people towards it. And the other, in Telemachus, reception is cordoned off to some even if they should hear it, according to a posited and unrelated category, which this cordoning off then extends to forms of speech. And from this only paradigms of inclusion and exclusion from normative orders of right can be generated, right? So it's a sort of story of the conditions of the generation of orders of right. The subtle difference on the level of hearing and being heard becomes a maximal difference as the scene plays out, as it poses to us the question of whether there was a bias in the ordinary ontology of language. And since the whole scene is the undertone of a forced poetry, right? Phemius is being paid to sing, he's being forced to sing a certain song, which precipitates different domination or the tone policing. Our answer has to be preconditioned, it's just a yes. Epitonics allows us to deepen this consideration. Telemachus's hearing is reactionary and unreflective, though it is projective, inasmuch as it seeks to establish what it seeks as a pre-established order, which is a distancing from the matrixal via a concern about knowledge or orchestration anxiety. Thence the creation of liminal conditions which allow tone policing as method of inclusion, which sublimates the operations of problematic differentiation based on categories and lineage. What is perceived aesthetically consubstantially creates an ethical position. Telemachus marks himself as the guardian of the sellable masculinized poet, aidos, via muthos, and through the right to muthos has dominion, and kratos is the term they used. He is autocratic, effectively, of the social realm, oikos, and the body of the mother. Elsewhere comes the proof of the ground of this anxiety, interestingly, Freudian avant la lettre, which conditions the telemachian hearing of tone, which is to say the combination of hermeneutical assumption and derivation of the wrong unconscious desire in the perceived secret of the mother's speech. In our scene, Penelope speaks as sort of god-woman, and Wilson translates it as like a goddess, but it's diagonaika. But Telemachus speaks back to her as mother. Note then that the body of the tone police is split in its functions, right, mother, queen. The first cut, which allows a second, between speech expressions, intent, and apparent intent. And mother takes on a particular tone as an inflection, whose predication we can find in the work only 100 lines earlier. So that's a kind of a measure by which you can hear poetic resonance across narrative poetry. Questioned about parentage by a disguised Athena, Telemachus utters the infamous skepticism, or as Hans Blumenberg has it, the example of man's worry about the ground of being, his Seingrundsorgen. Dear guest, says Telemachus, I will be frank with you. Athena's in disguise. My mother says I am his son, but I cannot be sure, since no one knows his own begetting. So he doesn't trust his mother to say who his father is. He immediately has already made his mother a whore. He does not believe the word of the mother, both provoked by and in spite of the words of the goddess. Identification with the father, which is perhaps the subject of the first part of the Odyssey, the Telemachia, demands a line drawn between the self and the mother. Yet mother in poetic tonality, its figurative form here, the sort of matrixal form, also thrums beneath Telemachus's poetic speech, because in its figurative form it just means originator, primary author. So Penelope also becomes nominated as the primary author of our scene. Thus, in the scene, we enter into a contest of wisdom or access to meaning between the originator, Queen Mother, and the kratos-wielding son. Telemachus' speaking is characterized as petnumenos, which is often translated as wise. Petnumai can mark measure and prudence, to have sense in the commonsensical variety. Those whose measured speech takes on such a characteristic are, as the disguised Athena sort of coaches Telemachus into knowing, wise peneutos observers. The Telemachian peneutos speech wields its wisdom and divides a population between observers and observed. So in this sense, the conditions of theory, as sort of Blumenberg puts it, are kind of set up or created. Telemachus's wish in speaking to his mother is to be the wise one, to be more than her secret knowing he is bothered by. A secondary effect of his attempt to enact a siding with the order he wishes to be part of ends up being his siding with the debauched suitors and the debased bard over his affected mother and her slaves. Penelope's entrance to the scene is also characterized as wise. Right? So this is sort of, we're in the realm partly of translation reception here, which has inflected an awful lot of the ways that we look at these scenes. Wisdom is doubly divided though, right? So it's not Penelope's speech that is characterized. Telemachus' speech is called this, but it's her being. So where for Telemachus what he produces generates tonal characterization, sort of a second order tonality, Penelope is given an epithet, one which is repeated at other stages in the poem, which is called periphron. Homerically, this is often translated as wise, but it can also mean careful, and emphatically so, very wise and very careful, considered in relation to thought, to tone production, peri-phren. It indicates a fully held tension in contrast to the Telemachus peneumenos. So we sort of have the diaphragm, the phrem, and Telemachus, where peneumenos is about the breath. So that In contrast to Telemachus, Penelope Periphron operates kind of with these mental ears at play, entering the scene, speaking with care about tone, in tone, working to give a clear and reasonable argument for a change in subject to the song. So her speech that is not there, she sort of says, I know that poetry is the following things, so I know, Phemius, you're capable of doing the following things, so please do them. But the reception of her speech is overdetermined by the imposition of a different gendered affectizing tone upon it. Yet Penelope's theme wildly contrasts to the Telemachian. The wisdom pepnumenai of Muthos is contrasted with the wisdom periphron of possibility of metapoesis in a different way, in a liberatory way. Listening again, Penelope's phronesis, she listens, is moved, and moves with others to take practical action. I'm sort of using it in the Homeric sense. Commands different poetic levels at play, is countered by reactionary misprision, the gendered and politicized subjugation of her frenetic act, as if it were phrenesis, madness. Under such tone conditions, it seems explicitly agreeing to disagree, or agreeing on a different level, is impossible. Reinscribed understanding of a familial imperial mythos is also off the table, and indeed the possibility charted by the scene of Discordia Concourse between Telemachus and Penelope, the poet, the slaves, and the others, sort of this agreeing to differ in a united state against the suitors rather than quibbling over what sublimates this conflict, which is the disagreement about song and power. This is overwritten by Telemachus's perhaps accidental concordance with a regime of subjugation and differentiation in his own performance of wisdom against that of his mother. Penelope is, and this is translated as startled here, she is surprised, thambasasa, and retreats, in which departure through Telemachus's cutting words, the space and the population of the palace is divided on classical lines. And I'd like to sort of emphasize that the line where Penelope sort of went back to her room. She moves backwards into the oikos, over which oikos sort of has demonstrated, and that Telemachian has demonstrated an articulate control. This scene of silencing is a policing of both tone and space, undergirded by the dominance and overwriting of an association of tone as part of balanced craft, which generates tone's more direct relation with wisdom through praxis forms, with one associating tone and propriety and class, which generates tone's relation with judgment and an idea of wisdom predicated on judgment's classifications. The tone policing of perceived backspeech does not, however, mean that Penelope's act has been without markers of courage or audacity. Right? So thambion, this thambasasa there, wonder or surprise, the characteristic given to Penelope's reaction to Telemachus' speech is related not 10 lines earlier in the book to Telemachus in relation to the flight of Athena. So Athena leaves flying, which surprises him into courage. So that thambion is related to courage. And courage here is both minos and thasos, not Andrea. So, yeah, minos thasos, sort of audacious daring, not without risk. Such surprise then surprises Penelope into realization and retreat. So we can see that the whole scene sort of moves around if we put different pressure on how these words kind of operate. Liberation is foreclosed here, but exiting and therefore no longer tone conditioning the scene is permitted, be this to weaving as she's commanded, or annihilation, which we see as a sort of other generic option in a bit. And in this scene then, an epitome, a threshold of entry to the Odyssey, and it occurs actually both at its start and end. So in book 1 and book 23, the same scene repeats, which is quite weird and rare. And the second scene is about the bow, not the lyre, right? So there's a sort of whole meta-poetic formation going on there about tension. Liberation is, and in the scene then, the epitome or threshold of entry to the Odyssey, at both its start and end, and the exposure of its logical setup and upsets occurs in a short epitomic form. So, meretrix, domination, instrumentalization. This should run just on the hour, just as a sort of marker of time, but we'll see. It is after the Homeric period that activity previously associated with eidos or andron eidos, the singer-bard poet in its phallogocentric aspect, begins to be overwritten by that infamous verb poein, to make, and its associated nouns. we shift to something more immediately recognizable to modern ears, right? Poein and poetis dominates, leaving eidos still in anachronic use, sublimating its tone policing in a silent carrying over, and carrying, so sort of poein overwrites it, but it's still there. There's a weird sort of mashup going on. Carrying tone's judgment relation and violences of its normatively understood sense into a phase of hyperclassification and hyperaestheticization. Dedicated examples, if you read, for all of the different definitions of what poetry might be, this sort of attempt to echolocate this kind of, and classify this thing, are the Politeia of Plato, book 8 and 10, and of course the Symposium, which Frank mentioned earlier in terms of love, but it's also very weird in terms of what poetry is there, because poetry is the immediate analogy, right? In Aristotle's Peripoeticus, which begins, let us now deal with poetry, its essence, and several species, and something of an antidote to these philosophical catalogues, Aristophanes generally, but the Thesmophoria Zuzai, which has is sort of a parody of all of the different, the fashion for the different definitions of what poetry is and its classification and its gendering. Whose variant relations to the political and aesthetic domains form the condition for the domination of a tone policing modality of tone productive modes today, be they artistic, philosophical, personal, social, or political. The commonplace that tone is pervasive, that it is in some way what exposes intention in giver or receiver, and thus generates reaction, persists and conditions considerations and fears of what use poetry might be put to, what poetry in its presentation represents. We meet repeatedly the normative idea that poetry, thought as a form of vulgar doublespeak, foments violence and or anti-regime-based collectives. The normative idea that the poetic mode, thought of as a form of enchanting or hermeneutic utterance, privileges navel-gazing in action over action. Modern defences of poetry often fall back on a classically indebted conflation of poein with the romantic idea of the lyric, that self-subjectivizing passionate articulation, which allows then both the sublimation and assumption of foundational violence by an aesthetic mode, and the assumption that the aesthetic mode is effective and affected personal utterance spoke contra mundum, which allows all voices to be heard in a poetry which is neatly extracted from everyday life. A restitution-oriented testimonial poetics whose basis is an established acceptance of identity politics, which emerges in a highly hyper-self-aestheticizing, problematic and non-liberatory way, one where under the regime of tone policing, whose ultimate mode is cultural fascism, the I, and indeed its full form of enunciation, the vexed I, let's call it, can always be bought or turned or tuned towards performing what is nominated outside of it as a cultural good. Recent commentaries allow us to hear better the stakes at play in the commonplaces or naturalized censoring senses of tone conditioning, which allow such apparently ethical positions to cut and exclude without rebuke within the conditions forced by the still pervasive idea of the West. I'll mention two to give a clear sense of the reach, but also the strange axis that the association of tone with poetics often treads between the textual and vocalic, which cases also bear clear warnings of the dangers of the fetishization of the aestheticized, the dangers of the wielding of a self-conscious and thence divisive tone art, the Telemarchian mode, in its performance-reception loop as a part of an articulate cultural regime formation. So there's an essay by Thomas Shestag, which is just called Poein, and it sets our textual scene. It is a hyper-articulation of the relationship of Poein as doing, for which he uses as a German stand-in tun, in speech and action, particularly in their textualized form and their relation to violence and sacrifice. A footnote hides the cutting truth of this poetical wager, the footnote being another site, of course, of the epitonic. Quote, but what if what is called articulation in poetry, in the making poein of a poem, covers a most incisive, most disruptive practice of cutting, temnine, into what is called a given word, a syllable, a letter, a cutting part what at first glance makes one think of a given word, but what at second glance disposes the word to further cuts, unquote. Articulation, the tension of tone, the tendons that join and joint bones, the clarity of utterance of speech sounds, is related in its Latinate form here to the limbs or lines that are held together and thence their differences. Right? Poein, conversely, is sparagmos and diaspora, so that the ripping apart of limbs and the scattering of these limbs. Community-based punishments, archaic, based on judgments of the impropriety of what has been considered other. Articulation as an apparently justified speaking overwriting poine hides not only a castration complex, but mobilizes poine to allow not only temno, the Greek to hew, maim, or sacrifice, but also parasso, to rip, tear, and shred, to be invoked in a feedback loop to articulation. For this to be paired in its overwriting with temno, Latin, or contemptor. This is the pure self-avowing hermetic violence of a certain poesis which is operative within the use of the term, creating a further demand of what tone conditions poine is mobilized within and against, such demand being present even when the word is unthinkingly used. And in such a tracing of a major aspect of poine's classically indebted modern Western tone condition, an assumption of a secret within the poetic held in plain sight, hearable warning within the parts of the words of a text enacted by that very partitioning given the work of the philologist's ear, and perhaps in here still exists therefore that frisson of jouissance, that difficult and always divided sense of enjoyment, or is it pain, that allows us to ascribe pleasure as the highest form of the aesthetic regime, to tacitly ascribe gender roles in this regime in poine, and perhaps get off on loudly, silently doing so, even when we are doing something as simple as mobilizing terminology or gesturing towards a name we give an artwork's gesture. Second, I don't need to really recapitulate the arguments to an EGS audience of the masterful work on voice by Mladen Dolar, a voice and nothing more, but under the auspices of a consideration of tone and tone policing, I'd like us to return to the book's opening. There is a story which goes like this. In the middle of a battle, there is a company of Italian soldiers in the trenches and an Italian commander who issues the command, soldiers attack. He cries out in a loud and clear voice to make himself heard in the midst of the tumult, but nothing happens. Nobody moves. So the commander gets angry and shouts louder, "Soldiers, attack!" Still nobody moves. And since in jokes things have to happen 3 times for something to stir, he yells even louder, "Soldiers, attack!" At which point there is a response. A tiny voice rising from the trenches saying appreciatively, "Che bella voce!" What a beautiful voice. Here, the divisive aspects of tone and voice projected and voice perceived, are clear. For the commander, the apparent inability to align tone and meaning, which is to say create a situation that is epitonic, reaching beyond the individual, allows the reactionary response, and not dissimilar moment of tone policing, here on the apparent basis of kind of perceived class, right, the commander and the soldiers rather than gender, the son and the mother, as the scene from the Odyssey. The regime of the aesthetic and the individualizing takes control in a moment which is action and collective dependent. The 2 faces of poine's coin, its aesthetic economy and categorical bias, are on full display. Blindness to the pitfalls of tone conditioning, or passive to how tone activates. It cannot be true that poetry makes nothing happen, but what happens in this regime of tone is not necessarily good, right? Everybody's dispossessed of everything. Poetry makes nothing happen, a slogan of W.H. Auden, extracted from his poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats, ripples with difficult ironies, and sort of is a foil to an extraction from Maurice Blanchot, published 10 years later, which appears to say the same thing. This is in the sort of the work on Kafka and literature. That even at its highest, art has no rights against the claim of action. Both address art on the basis of art being a mediation of language and voice. Auden on Yeats, Blanchot on Kafka's late story Josephine, Die Sängerin oder das Volk der Mäuse. Each pictures a particular take on the use and abuse of the question of the author personality and its narcissistic self-aestheticizing relation to an oeuvre. Blanchot continues, and this is in Lydia Davis's translation, "It is powerless, but its awareness of this illegitimacy does not resolve the conflict. The self-sacrificial renunciation of a problematically impotent system does no good. Its poetry with poine, what we might call lyric now, will to annihilation is quite simply inscribed within it." This is one version of many readings of this story of Kafka, the Josephine story, as parabolic in some way for the condition of art and the dangers of aestheticization or fetishization on the artist of creator, on the receivers, willing or not, and on the so-called work of art itself. With the question of tone production and the various divisive receptions of tone art in mind, let us listen to the start of Kafka's tale. And perhaps we should also remember that for Benjamin, I think it's the poetic Dichtung, which was the name for Kafka's failure. So Kafka as poet comes in again. Josephine, die Sängerin oder das Volk der Mäuse. Unsere Sängerin heißt Josephine. We have a name, Josephine. Note the nominating and hyper-individualizing in this epitonic production. And we have a role, the singer, die Sängerin. We have a populace, the mouse folk, with Volk bearing the full whack of its intonation in the early 1900s, which is given as an alternative option of titular or capital alignment to Josephine. So choose X or Y is a way to read this story. It's almost like choose your own adventure in a Kafkian mode. The cult of personality or the cult of the people, the cult of art or the cult of the people. And Kafka gives us a further divide, emphasized by both title and first line of the story. The singer is affirmatively, excessively feminine. In this, Sänger, back translated to Eiros, is subjected to a belated counter-feminization, which, once we scratch the surface, denotes the female singer's exclusion from and being dispossessed of the general act of singing, and carries a classical history of the female singers or poets abjuring this term, both Eiros and Poein, for their work. Kafka demonstrates the divided roots of song or of poetic making and their relation to tone policing through a double avowal of the feminine singer, so that not quite just singer, and the term ownership, our singer, which extends to the ownership of the act, its definition, and potentially the body of the so nominated singer at the very threshold and opening of the story. But the story, nevertheless, points to the dangers of tone art's apotheosis. If you've not read it, it's very available online in multiple different languages. It's a strange chiastic-seeming self-enclosure. Right? So you have Josephine, this Sängerin, the Volk, the Mäuse, our Sängerin, and Josephine. So we have a cosmos. The chiastic-seeming self-enclosure with the ideological, das Volk der Mäuse, the Volksgenosse of the community at the center of song, right? So again, there's something similar to the Telemachian mythos going on here. Under this central regime, here is nothing ultimately to be done but to create a logic of tone policing that binds the song to attribute, classifies it in a way that, even if classification fails, does not fail to put song in its place through this aesthetics of classification. And that's basically a summary of the plot. The activation of the art of tone with ideology at its core, even if it makes what seems like a liberatory move, is indeed doomed to repeat the violences inscribed in what it seeks liberatory redefinition against. We are not given one choice, the singer or the people, but four: Josephine, the name; the female singer, the function; or the people, the mice, or the ideology, focused. But the mouse people control the mythos against song and choose themselves in their ideological orientation after the function, song, appears too unstable. Also a bit of a spoiler, plot spoiler, and the function disappears before their very eyes or ears. They are articulate throughout in their tone blindness. Yet this is not before the feminizing experiment of name and function, which creates narrative propulsion. Another name we would give that is mythos, by subjecting both to a minute examination of their parts, returning us to Shestag's temno, a ripping apart annihilation of tone, in whose astringent examination of tone's apparent capacities or conditions, and thus the creation of a non-deviating set of generic expectations. In this, one becomes tone deaf. Yet, in the idea of Josephine as the piping, so she doesn't sing, she pipes, which we will soon relate to the Greek word for vocalic clarity, lyriouran, does contain in its epitone as extension a movement towards the making possible of an idea of immanence, something that is out with the mythopoetic Politis expectations of tone. Josephine's is not back-talking, but back-piping, which is ultimately the same act. And I'd like to thank Frank for the dreadful Scottish pun here with the link to bagpiping. But I'd also like, as a Scot, there perhaps note the links of the pipe to the slua germ, from which Gaelic, the term slogan, which is a collectivizing, crying out and community-forming collective cry, sluach being community or multitude, germ being cry, crow, or declaration, which operates, I guess, a bit like the haka, right? It brings people together, it's a collective cry. In Josephine, we meet two sides of the slogan, right? So in the pipe, the slogan is Leninist operation, hence failed except in how we, the readers, galvanize around Josephine, and the slogan as brand sloganization or ideological selling out, the voice of the mouse folk. Anyway, that's an aside. But again in the story, there emerges no situation where discordia concauses sight of imminent liberation is possible. Two tone regimes are simply juxtaposed to the clear benefit of one and the annihilation or at least retreat of the other. Josephine disappears. And yeah, at this point, there's a whole thing that we're missing out. So I'm sorry that we're not getting Mallarmé. I'm sorry we're not getting Alban Berg. And I'm sorry that we're not getting Fazil Say's amazing Kara Toprak. Think of those things. Auden's poem continues, yet it survives, a way of happening, a mouth, and it. Poetry without poine, as it were, poetry dispossessed of its aestheticizable attributes, or with those attributes made so vulgarly clear we must seek to subtract ourselves from them, survives in strange topologies. The art of tone divides how we hear art and indeed tone into relative and absolute regimes of intelligibility, into the riddle's hermeneutic aestheticizing or mystical invitation, and the immanent, which admits the unintelligible. Auden's poem's conclusion may appear to be a bucolic turning inwards, right? There's a very specific way in which it can be read and has been read, yet it's also an act of projective imagination whose potential in its articulating a site of liberation from capitalism, not without its own anxieties, is a primary site of affirmation. So even tone deafness is split in a way. You can move inwards to articulate something, or you can just be tone deaf. One reactionary, one activated and activating, dare we say activist, we have finally established the thought of two modes of tone as test, divisive and one with the potential for articulate liberation. Tone activation. Penelope's and Josephine's activations of an art of tone, ultimately in different ways failures, they both disappear, are nevertheless initially a use of tone as a part of a defensive move, which is also one which an act towards a kind of a different good. They are epitonic inasmuch as both stretch out further than the self, even as far as those who do not understand what the effects of such a tone art might be, and who therefore may foreclose its possibilities through the manufacture of a situation of tone policing out of the conditions set by tones being present. Tone policing is a matter of relativity, of relatives, of relativism, of a need to instantiate and contain semantic genericity, an assumption that tone is test, riddle, or lure with an answer whose enunciating subject must be dispossessed, suppressed, or oppressed, and it's disorientating. But in these ursines of tone, part of poetic prehistory, where poine had not come into conceptual or practical articulation yet, poetry or song still leaks through as a ground note and informs even the most modern innovators of tone. The undertone, though nevertheless not unproblematically still riven through with gender and racializing debate, gives us a sense that tone condition might not always put us into the different places that a reactionary economy and administration of an idea of knowledge might endow. Is tone always a matter of taking sides, of taxonomization, of the operation of a hermeneutics of suspicion, be it hermeneutic, affective, sociocultural, or quasi-analytical? Or is it just such tone as is foundational to the performance of the idea or ideology of the West to itself, of itself to itself? I'd like to allow Josephine, the female singer, to lead us through a moment of echolocation as part of this undertone or undertow towards a counterposition. Ictus. The counterposition will be one epic siren scene of the classical Greek tradition from the Odyssey to an epic siren scene out of the Hellenistic tradition of Ptolemaic Arsinoean Egypt. Ptolemy was the king and Arsinoe the queen who presided over the arts. Highly problematical, imperial and totally incest-based, but nevertheless. And this is from Apollonius Rhodius's Argonautica, which offers a metapoetic, untimely and decentered commentary on the tone production conditions established via the problem of inheriting Greece. And we talked, the seminar today talked a little bit about this inheriting of Greece with Heidegger, with Hölderlin, but Apollonius is also staging inheriting Greece, or Hellas, and which from Egypt. And which we may also read as an ancient scene of an attempt to think a liberatory poetics of tone, nevertheless written under a hyper-imperial superstructure. Bringing us up to date with regard to the poet's ear, Apollonius shies away from how the poetic articulation of poine had conditioned centuries of literature between Homer and him, resetting things to a para-Homeric discourse, which is instructive in terms of what the expectations are of hearing this work, which is emergent from Alexandria. The poem of the Argonautica, deliberately anachronic, is only aligned to scenes of culture-making, belief-forming practices. So the only times in the Argonautica poem is used is in building altars and moments of propitiatory blood sacrifice, and of judgment in the arena of forced love. So poem comes to stand in effectively for rape. Thus poem is unvoiced, right? He takes the voice away, makes it just making, problematic making. On the other hand, both Aido, our song, and the lesser used phone, in epic at least, voice, sound, and speech, are fully part of an active principle in the text of songs and poetry's use as a difficult thinking practice within the realm of action as much as contextual communication. And it's not, and none of those words, neither Aido and its cognates or phone, are gender individual, species, or life limited. Even the mast of the Argo made of Dodonian oak speaks. And they're always linked to communication practices marked by modulations in tone and problems. We're jumping over Kafka's late story on the Sirens, which is a sort of a kind of an ironic expression of the ultimate expression of the West's sort of tabula rasa complex. But jumping over that, returning momentarily to Josephine allows us to do something, to link tone with what initially seems like style, but what is in fact a form of clarity, and to come back to our opening scene. Which seems to hinge on an active articulation of that's not being made clear enough, right? For when we read Kafka's story, we note the insistence not on singing per se, as I've already said, which from the outset of the title, singing stands in for a multiple suite of dispossessions, rather on piping or whistling, the verb pfeifen in German, to pipe as sort of as on a flute, or simply via the early Latin pipo, to sort of peep or cheep, or to make a clear sound, one that cuts through others from the mouth. And according to the story, this is also the clarifying tone of the mouse voice. Josephine nominates what's called her singing actually piping. So she avows that she pipes and nominates this style, and the piping doesn't come with an extra gender suffixal modification of the already suffixed active verb into a noun. So there's no in at the end that hyperfeminizes it. And if we take Josephine's nomination of her practice at its word, reading the tale ultimately as a scene of tone policing, we may well hear in this such piping a different way of staging a talk back. She pipes out extraordinarily against normative piping herself out of normative history in order to expose the tabula rasa complex of this complex. So she pipes the clair obscur, which piping has an interesting history. Echolocate pfeifen, we are coming to the Sirens, I promise. And we may hear ligis, a clarity or shrillness of voice in ancient Greek, sometimes translated to piping or whistling. Ligis, which in both the Odyssey and the Argonautica is multi-toned, right? In addition to which the Argonautica's position on song is anachronic, seeking to undo this kind of Homeric tone policing of eidos throughout. And so it's an epic counter-epic from as many angles of reception as possible. It's associated, ligist, to tones, animation, and wind, in birdsong, in the sound of the lyre, the forminx usually, in male and female and ghostly lamentation and recognition, and echoing its Iliadic use, where it is only really used for clarity of expression. And in the Odyssey, the clarity of expression is of Zeus, the Heliades and the Muses, and in the Argonautica of Medea. And in both, importantly, in all, importantly, this is the sound of the Sirens. Of course, the biases of translation history demonstrate how much the Sirens' liai bears the weight of association with the inhuman, with lament, and with birdsong, be it prophetic or otherwise, generating a critical fetishization complex not dissimilar to that we witness in Josephine. Yet the tone conditions set by liai, particularly in its rhetorical association, in fact, with the plain style, liai, via its Iliadic expression, would perhaps ask us to hear differently. So we could return to the epigraph at the beginning from Solon, or we could also hear liai in the 3rd century poet Corinna in an invective on judgment, on the judgment of women poets. So she invokes the eris of the poet Myrtis, Eris, competitive Eris, with Pindar. And it was Myrtis who was ligurine, clear-sounding, against Pindar. So too must the association of the mode lius with both Sirens and Orpheus, his forminx is also described in this way, as well as with in Homer the persuasion of the Muses and the cry of Penelope before this scene, and in Apollonius with the persuasion of Medea, she has a clear muthos, in fact, cause us to bend our ear in question a little further, which allows us in turn to rehear the tone conditions of Josephine, but we'll move to the Sirens. Oh, I'm going to run over by 5. The Siren scene of the Odyssey is so infamous and hypertheorized, I don't need to provide full recapitulation. Odysseus and the Sirens were told repeatedly as a scene about his Palumatus's operative will towards knowledge. There's a lovely bit in Blanchot where he calls it his deliberate stubbornness, which leads to universal domination. And it's also in Ursine as Adorno and Horkheimer pose it of the structuration of enjoyment in capital. The organisation of dominance here, where he forces the people on the ship into deafness and the Sirens to destruction. It's a scene of domination through unlearning on the one side and destruction on the other side, and enjoyment for one him alone seems to be the rule in the Odyssey. The Sirens in their song or tone of voice is here considered under the auspices of suspicion as lure, right? They're sort of acting against the potential that they're going to lure you in, are creating these conditions. When tone is considered a mortal test, there is no conversation, only either conversion, death conversion in this case, or death. Against this, we'll turn to the Argonautica. Here, Orpheus, who's operating in a different sort of dominantly homosocial environment to Odysseus, he's less received in terms of the Siren scene than he is various post-Ovidian hypervisuocentric and narrative considerations, which often bear a Neoplatonic and Christian, densely hermetic or early modern rhetorical inflection, right? So we associate mostly Orpheus with the Eurydice story and its way of the way of Orpheus sort of playing, relating taxonomization to nature. And that's often put, that kind of other version of Orpheus is often put across as a choice between world or wife or liar, right? But this story is not part of the Argonautica. The dominantly homosocial society on board is overseen by Jason, who's actually a self-debunking hero. So when they're setting up the thing, Jason's kind of like, I don't want to be the hero. Okay, well, they kind of want Heracles. And the companions, all of the companions of which Orpheus is one, are considered fellow advisors. And the word there, it's a really interesting one. And if anybody's more interested, come back to it because there's an exceptionally long footnote, is sumestor. And it's quite a rare word whose meaning we might extend to fellow traveller, like comrade, to whom we must make a side note that included in this comradely group is Medea. And the flexible leadership structure destructurates the usual practical and Homeric expectation of the kind of hierarchy of shipbound life as mimicking structures of rule on land. The self-debunking hero leader is not the ship's helmsman, who is Tiphys. And there is a flexible movement in the group leadership dependent on the task at hand. So this is so different to the Odyssey, and it's really different to the infamous sort of Platonic extension of the idea of the ship of state. In the case of the Sirens, Orpheus's poetic skill set, his poet's ears, are called upon to preserve rather than subjugate two communities suddenly. In its short form, the clear-voiced Sirens sing, phroné, imminent peril is indicated, and Orpheus produces the lyre and a song, and they sail on past. But there are tone conditions that are activated here. First, the Argo is prepared, and then in full sail. And this means the ropes are stretched taut from the yard arm supporting the sail. And of course, the nautical is the place where forms of tone condition, which stress literally epitonically supported, controls navigation. The thematological, of course, extends to have metapoetic dimensions. On the ocean, we're in the domain of tone of the ship. And the cognates of this verb, tanusantes, span sailing, stringing of lyres and bows, weaving and horsemanship, and are moving at full stretch with high intensity. And this is all in the domain of that kind of clear-sounding Liguran tone. Secondly, the deathly voice beguiling or desire inducing or tone out of the sirens is indicated in this scene in the past tense against the swift forward movement of the argo. The normative explanation of the siren song is repeated, forming an envelope for what first reads like a digressive analepsis, but is also a swift balancing of the fact that we already have a clear sense of back history to the fellow travellers of the argo and a tone establishment. So it's setting two sides up to be received, okay? It asks us to note this analepsis, the familiar relation of the sirens to Terpsichore and their song's relation to Persephone and her abduction. The form of this analeptic digression allows the historicity that's generated the tone art of the sirens to be shown as held within the repetition of the song. So the song itself holds its history, but we only hear the sort of temptation that is apparently its history. The repetition in these lines of the sirens' habits, or our learned perception of the significance of their song, turns the focalization to the present. Just as the Argo and its inhabitants have turned their attention to the island and its inhabitants, so then do the inhabitants of Anthemoessa turn their attention to the Argo. Across these lines, the song has been descriptively qualified in very different ways, all of which have been associated with what one might pitch as their antagonists at different points in the Argonautica. So the descriptions here of the siren song have been used at different points for various of the Argonauts and various of the sort of cosmic kind of aspects of this, and vice versa. So there's a sharing of tone. And we're invited to, through these shifting descriptive perspectives and through the repetition, to reconsider the preconceptions that we might have brought to this scene. Have we been tone policing what we have been taught to call the sirens? But we're also invited to do so under pressure. Are they going to fall for the same trap? As the vulgar function of the analepsis, the repetition is also to produce a narrative and lyrical tension. So tone is swift passage towards a test on tone. And at this moment of tension, a new name, Orpheus, emerges into action. Parallel to the ship's sail being made taut by the yardarm using the same verb, just as the moment it seems as if the fellow travellers are united in perceiving the sirens in the normative way, the sirens turn and seem like they're going to act in the normative way. Orpheus strings his lyre, and he brings forth a strong and multi-toned song. And the line is gorgeous. Krapnian oitrokalio melos kanaches and iodes. A whole line made of words of measure and sound, of tone, that breaks up melos in the middle to something that's not honey as we would know it. A balance in simultaneously happening of logics of tonation, multi-tonic siren and multi-tonic lyre is established, as much as clear differences are marked in both how each tones are written and what attributes they are given. Never the twain shall meet. They both clearly represent a pointed series or serial suite of logics of tone. And importantly, Orpheus strings his own lyre. And it's not called, it's importantly also called a forminx. This may seem like a simple moment of quick self-reliance, but compare this momentarily to the tone scene of the Odyssey, Book 1, where Phemius, who's been commanded to sing to the suitors, is given a pre-tuned lyre by slaves. Orpheus, rather, can tune the lyre in accordance to the contemporary logic, which is not ossified into diatonic universal or normative tuning, yet allowed for any form of idiosyncratic stringing in accordance with the tonal need of the song or moment. So it's kind of the idea of the tone row, like tone row avant le ton, perhaps. With Orpheus's song, the fellow travellers on the Argo are conditioned to be orientated differently to the sirens, so their singing is no longer a lure. And the sirens' voices too shift in how they are presented in the text and given a different use, a different interpretation. In this strange encounter, both Argonauts and even Butes, who is the one that swims towards the sirens, beguiled by their clarity of tone, by the way, the Argonauts, Butes, and the sirens all survive. The latter's voices are finally described as akritos, which is never-ending, common and countless of the usual translations, but also unjudged or not giving judgment. Ultimately, there is no narrative or judgment-based closure of the scene for either group. Both continue what they had been doing. There's no aesthetic judgment, no mythos domination given in the text. The Argo passes on. The auditors on board, our collective, who have heard together, are now in this transitional passage seized with anguish or anxiety, parakthos, pain, distress, anxiety. But again, parataxis here is proof against judgment. So where the lines are cut and where kind of implications of intention take place is really important. So we're left to wonder, is the anxiety an anxiety of receptive projective identification? They've heard the story nested in the Siren's song due to its enframing by Orpheus, and they feel kind of bad. They have an anxiety for the Siren's future, an anxiety of departure, having realized that the honey sweet, the melicized idea of the singular nostoi with which they had preceded this encounter is the real lure, right? So it's a lure against a lure. Or is it an anxiety in the demand to continue to persist? They have much worse things in store. This might be read as a story of breaking through difficulty to discordia concourse, of a non-economizable live and let live, in which there is no police politics of the threshold. Both communities continue in their collective poetic existential tasks, each one foiling the other, neither are foiled, violently debased or obliterated. A hearing acknowledgement of tone conditions, even in taut or high-strung moments, that allows an ontological status of tone without the domination of the fearful reception that is judgment, allowing an affirmative preservation of coexistence in a way. The Argo moves on towards different and noisier challenges. I think Charybdis, hammer-like Charybdis, coming from within and out with the idea of the West to the West. So its map is amazing. This tone-conditioned hearing that has been, is allowed, taking the tone mobilized against tone in the very articulation of the West at its so-called ground seriously. It poses a slight of opposition to tone policing in its explicitly violent and apparently compassionate forms, of the possibility of variant common possibilities of tone to coexist, if not in solidarity with each other, certainly in solidarity against obliteration and ignorance. Thank you.